your paper explores both Nietzsche's perspective and the Zen Buddhist perspective. Can you talk to me just about why you think that the Zen Buddhist perspective fits with Nietzsche's philosophy?
Yeah, so Nietzsche does speak about Buddhism a little bit, and though he has some positive things, remarks about Buddhism, like for instance, he says it's a religion in his terms beyond good and evil. You know, it doesn't hold to an objective morality. It doesn't, morally condemn non-adherence of the religion. It's sort of very empirically based. It focuses on getting rid of suffering as the main goal, not getting rid of like sin or anything like this. Still, Nietzsche has a generally negative view towards him. He sees it as like a more advanced stage of nihilism, which is sort of like coming into Europe as a secular nihilism that will replace the Christian nihilism. And I mean, he's not incorrect. I mean, you can see why he jumped to the conclusion. I mean, typically Buddhism is understood as as a soteriological goal of Buddhism is to um, escape from the reality of the here and now, which is we're stuck in the cycle of birth and rebirth, samsara, which is characterized by dukkha, which is dissatisfaction or unease, suffering in sort of bad translation. And the way to get out of it is sort of by doing these practices and meditating and in doing these things that the Buddha recommends. You can reach nirvana, which is sort of like a cessation of suffering, where you forget the self and uh, enter unconditioned existence, which, as you might surmise, is sort of pretty much exactly like a Hinterwelt, any other Hinterwelt that we've been discussing before. There's a goal to get out of the here and the now and achieve a state where an ideal state in which we're saved from the here and the now. The thing that might even be more distressing for Nietzsche is sort of the loss of the self. Although I'd say Christianity also has this. It's sort of Nietzsche might see that as a sort of self-hating kind of thing. But anyway, yeah, Nietzsche was only familiar with sort of poorly translated texts of early Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism, which he sort of got from Schopenhauer, his mentor. And Schopenhauer interprets it in a very pessimistic sense. Schopenhauer is a noted pessimist, great philosopher, by the way, but definitely a pessimist. And Nietzsche's interpretation of Buddhism is very much colored by this. Nonetheless, Buddhism has gone through sort of 2,000 years of development since Nietzsche understood it. And Zen, Mahayana Buddhism, is sort of the opposite branch of Buddhism. And particularly Zen, I think, push back against the narrative of Theravada in a very similar way that Nietzsche does. The reason for this, with Zen in particular, is because this is when Buddhism migrated north into China and sort of fused with Taoism. And Taoism already has a lot of agreements with Nietzsche in terms of sort of the anti-teleology and purposelessness. The sort of the main tenet of Wu Wei of non-action is often translated as effortless action, but maybe a better translation, people have argued, is purposeless action. That is sort of the standard for how to act in accordance with reality, because reality is itself purposeless. So yeah, very different from the Socratic sort of nous that's embedded in reality, and there's a fundamental ground, as we were saying. So when Buddhism comes into contact with Taoism, they fuse and make Zen. And Zen pushes back heavily on all this rhetoric and almost to an irreverent degree, right? I mean, Linji, for instance, one of the Zen scholars, is famous for his phrase, if you see the Buddha on the road, kill the Buddha, you know? And it's meant to be a get rid of anything external from yourself that you think will get you enlightenment. The idea that there is a path, that there is something to get, there is such a thing as samsara and nirvana, and some place you need to go in order to attain enlightenment. That is sort of what is keeping you from enlightenment in the first place. You know, the first shift is with Nagarjuna, who's like the most famous, most important Buddhist thinker outside of the Buddha himself. And his main contribution is shunyata, which is emptiness. And emptiness is sort of a radical reformation of dependent origination, which is one of the core Buddhist doctrines, which is that basically the interdependence of all objects and ideas and things. Everything is dependent on something else, and everything exists in this way, where there are no essences, there is no singular existence, and everything is dependent on itself. Emptiness takes this even further, where it says that not only are sort of things empty, but even philosophical doctrines are empty. They only make sense in relation to other things. They only make sense sort of in the context from which they arrive. So when you had the historical Buddha speaking to the people in 1500 BC and telling them about samsara and nirvana and how to attain enlightenment, this isn't some ultimate truth that's you sort of separated from everything else that we have to strive towards. Like, no, it's a way of doing expedient means, which is sort of a partial truth, a contextual truth, which is supposed to help someone attain realization. For the people at that time that the Buddha was speaking to, he had to speak in words that they would understand in that context. And so he spoke of samsara and the liberation from samsara and meditation and whatnot. But these aren't ultimate truths. Ultimately, everything is empty. And even though that already sort of takes away a lot of the soteriological thinking, right, of getting rid of an ultimate truth, there's still, depending on the school of Mahayana, there's still some soteriology. Like, the goal becomes, instead of attaining nirvana, you're understanding emptiness, and then sort of you attain nirvana. But Zen especially pushes back heavily against this. An important thing, even before with Nagarjuna, but is also the emptiness of emptiness. The concept of emptiness itself is itself empty. It doesn't have any content. It's not a belief. It's not something to achieve. It's more sort of a rhetorical tool to get you to understand certain truths, and you have to abandon it at a certain way as well. And the notion of the no self is still prevalent in Zen, and but rather than being a sort of self-hating doctrine, as the earlier one might be seen by someone like Nietzsche as a sort of will to destroy oneself to escape actuality. The no self is, I think, in Zen, a way for you to fully affirm existence. Right, the thing that's preventing you from affirming existence is the self itself, because the self, I think this is sort of the key insight of Buddhism, is that the self, when there is an ego self, it necessarily reaches for salvation. It necessarily wants to escape from its present position, because the self wants to be independent. It wants to have this standalone existence and be sort of the ground for its own being. But it can't do this because of dependent origination, the fact that everything is interlinked, including the self. And so it constantly strives to try and ground itself in something. And the way to affirm existence is to sort of forget the self. And so I would say the goals in both Nietzsche and Zen are very similar. It's an anti-soteriology in both. The goal of both is to try and get rid of the notion that there is something that you need to be saved from. The notion of there being a goal or a purpose to reality and existence.
Wow, that was certainly a lot. I wrote down here that the self reaches for salvation, and so the only way to affirm existence is to get rid of the self.
Mm-hmm.
But Nietzsche would say, actually, affirm it, like the difference, as I understand it, is the path to this anti-soteriology or anti-salvation for Zen Buddhism is to get rid of the self. For Nietzsche, it's to affirm the self.
I would say this is part of where the critique gets a bit shaky, because Nietzsche also doesn't believe in a fundamental self. The self for Nietzsche is still like a set of drives that are sort of competing. There's no core to the self, and the sort of dualities that we always impose onto the world, such as subject and object, are more like products of language, sort of simplifications for evolution that sort of helps us survive, useful tools. Yeah, so Nietzsche as well has a notion of the self. But I do think that fundamentally what you're saying is correct in practice. I think in practice, Nietzsche doesn't quite embody the forgetting of the self. Uh, the fact, I think, that Nietzsche's work, Nietzsche's thought contains within it a lot of tension still. This sort of existence is still something that's almost antagonistic for Nietzsche. Like there's a need to affirm it, sort of as a heroic struggle against nihilism that he sees himself embarking on. And yes, those notions are notions that like reinforce the self. And I think the where the eternal recurrence comes into this is that the eternal recurrence is fundamentally still a willing, a willing of amor fati, a willing of existence to repeat itself infinitely. Um, and the fact that there is a willing means that there's still sort of a self, obviously, to do the willing, and there's still sort of like some kind of antagonism, some sort of separation of the self from the world. As I was saying with joy, the eternal recurrence. If you look through the book Zarathustra, which is Nietzsche's main book on the eternal recurrence, the origin of the eternal recurrence lies in sort of like a deep joy, a love for life. You love it so much that you want it to recur infinitely, right? Um, so this deep joy, however, I think for Zen, I think the joy would not be deep enough. Sort of Nietzsche is almost like a few steps away, maybe, because the deepest joy under a Zen perspective doesn't want to recur. It doesn't want anything because there is no self. It's fully satisfied with existence and needs nothing from it. Nietzsche's sort of like desire to make existence recur still sort of like betrays a subtle hint that he isn't perfectly content with reality as it is, because he sees the need for existence to recur infinitely. Um, when you experience sort of the most profound joy for Zen, you don't experience anything. There is only the experience. There's a complete collapse of the separation between the self and reality. We can think of the eternal recurrence. This is a good analogy. It's sort of, when you're getting enraptured by music and sort of you start thinking, I wish this would last forever, or any positive experience. You start thinking, I wish this would last forever. And it's sort of that very thought is what sort of takes you out from the experience and separates it and sort of puts you back to reality in crude terms, right? I think that's a pretty good analogy, because it's sort of the ego self reasserting itself. The desire for the continuation of that experience is what causes the joy to be lessened, right? And yeah, if the joy is deep enough, obviously that desire wouldn't be there in the first place.
I have two questions. One is a point of clarification. So when you're talking about this idea of getting rid of the self from Zen Buddhism, is that just something like the way it sounds like is it's like you're just existing and you're content with that existence in the world around you, but you're not you're not seeing yourself as a like a definitive main character in this world. You're just living, and whatever happens to you happens, and you're content with that. Now, is that an oversimplification of the theory?
I mean, obviously, it's a simplification, but I'd say that's quite accurate in general. I think it's the lack of purpose that's important, right? You don't need anything from reality. The noble truths of the Buddha, the Four Noble Truths, are basically that there is sort of an inherent suffering, dissatisfaction in reality, and that suffering is caused by grasping, and grasping can be understood as in you want something out of reality. Reality isn't good enough for you, so you need to try to extract something from it. And so the self is that which grasps, and so letting go of the self is letting go of the grasping, and you're sort of just like fully taken over. You don't need anything to happen to you. You don't want anything to happen to you.
But with Nietzsche, it's like I want the self to I want to feel the pain. I want to feel these emotions because this is I want to very much affirm the things that are happening to me.
Yes, I'd say he finds meaning in the struggle itself. The struggle to affirm is what like gives him meaning, and so the struggle to impose an eternity and make things eternal, right? But that's still a struggle that's destined to fail because you can't actually make things eternal.
Now,
Everything is
now,
transient.
now, to me, the Nietzsche ideal not only sounds much more plausible. I think it's a more just. I'm just speaking personally. It seems more attractive of a philosophy to have. But I want to ask you: Is this getting rid of the self? Is this something that you personally think is a plausible ideal that we can actually work towards getting rid of the self? Is the Zen Buddhism idea something? Because I understand it in the abstract and in the theoretical, but I don't even know if that's desirable to be honest
Mhm.
in the first place. And two, I don't know if that's fully possible.
Yeah, so obviously, like it's very confusing the whole no self doctrine. It takes a lot of sort of time and thinking about it in weird ways to get into it. And I mean, even I, who am studying this thing, I can say I don't understand it fully because it's something quite strange. But I mean, according to a Zen position, that's fine. There's actually nothing to understand in the end. There's no like hidden truth behind it. But in any case, the when we talk about sort of forgetting the self and getting rid of the self, you don't actually mean getting rid of like get really not having any sense of self at all, but it's more about realizing the inherent interconnectedness with everything and not striving, as I was saying, not grasping onto things or needing things from reality. So it's a different way of viewing the self, sort of the self as we view it now. We sort of always think that there's something wrong with ourselves right now, and we always seek to get rid of it through whatever means possible. And this can go back to sort of the secular salvation we were talking about. I mean, you can do a very good, I think, Buddhist analysis of the way we seek to relieve our sense of lack from by using these secular salvations. We're sort of under a Buddhist hypothesis. We're always haunted by sort of this sense of lack, that there's something wrong with me right now. And the reason is because the self, as I want it to be, doesn't actually exist. The self isn't grounded. It isn't this like stable sort of metaphysical entity that's like separate from everything else. Um, and Well, forgetting the self is basically letting go of this need to ground yourself in anything, letting go of sort of the idea that I must do this in order to have value, otherwise I don't have value. It's an sort of infinite um, a realization of sort of the inherent valuelessness, but also um, value, the source of value. There's this paradox as well, like valuelessness. Value comes from valuelessness in a very real sense.
But do you personally find that desirable?
Uh, yeah, I would say so. Generally, if this kind of thing is possible, I think yes, I would say. Um, Again, the way Zen conceives of enlightenment is not some like mystical state that you've got to achieve. Um, that's going to be there forever. We've all had like I think moments of enlightenment. I mean, the specific term I think that's useful to understand for the purposes of the Nietzsche comparison as well is tathata, right? It's that, which literally means suchness. It's experiencing sort of reality as such without mediating it um, through any of your own sort of like personal biases and concerns and wants. You know, um, and as I was saying, I think the moments of joy and I think even aesthetic experiences, they're always at their highest when you sort of forget your own personal concerns. I mean, me personally, I can say, um, and this relates to things like flow state as well. For instance, in modern psychology, you would say when you're sort of really focused and involved in an activity, you always forget yourself. It's like yourself that you deal with in normal days, sort of the desires and the preoccupations that sort of drive you in ordinary life aren't there. And the way I would see the Zen form of forgetting the self is to sort of, you know, always be in that state or be in it as much as possible.
Okay. I think this Zen Buddhist perspective for me is gonna take. Well, could you just try to just in very like simple terms say what it would be like for an ordinary person who is in the Nietzschean state to then transition to the Zen Buddhist state? Would their life change in any tangible sense, or is it entirely in the psychological state that the different distinction between the two is? Like how, because again, this idea of forgetting, of letting go of the self, in principle, that's concept that I can grasp and understand, and theoretically it makes sense. But it strikes me as something where it's like it's impossible for people to grasp until they have achieved it, and maybe even then they don't know exactly what it is. They just know that they are in it.
Hmm. Well, the Zen perspective is particularly strange, I'd say, but also more simple in a sense, where there isn't actually something you need to realize. There isn't actually a special state in which you have to reach. Despite what I've been saying, if you think you're enlightened, then you're not enlightened, because you you clearly haven't got it. Um, you sort of have these. You've taken these ideas of what you think enlightenment means from somewhere else and sort of like imposed them on yourself and done this kind of thing. But in comparison to Nietzsche, I'd say like even more charitably would say that sort of the Zen no self state is what Nietzsche was aiming for in his life, but didn't quite get. And I'd say that might be going a bit far, but uh, I think it's possible. In terms of the difference between the two, I'd say again, Nietzsche perpetuates this struggle against existence. It's sort of like a triumph that needs to be had, which maintains this teleological attitude, I do think, of like, life is something that needs to be affirmed, and we're going to get to that point later on. You're delaying this. And Zen, I think, would be the full realization of this. Nietzsche has a very good quote that I like, where he says, "Mature manhood is regaining the seriousness one had as a child at play." You know, and I think that embodies the Zen ideal. The playfulness often comes in a lot with all the masters, because there's no point to what they're doing. There's no ultimate purpose. They're just doing it as a reflection of existence in a sense. But it doesn't mean that they're sort of unserious about things or they don't care about anything. Because if you look at children in play, they're very serious when they play. They're very involved in it, right? But they don't sort of actually care about it in an existential sense.
Turning more to, well, shifting gears a little bit, and I know if you're listening, you might be like, what the fuck is going on? And like, I get that because I'm a little bit in that same boat too. William here is a brilliant philosopher and an expert, and it's gonna
Yeah.
take a lot to get on his level.
As I was saying, no,
But
Zen is an entire tradition, so it's quite difficult to condense it all very quickly. And I mean, even that's a problem with my paper. I'll fully admit that it's comparing one thinker to an entire tradition, which is a difficult challenge, and especially to someone who's familiar with neither, it's quite difficult. But yes.